Alright, so the history of the automobile is inextricably linked to the manual transmission. I mean, it's not exactly a spoiler to say that automatics weren't always around, and that people had to essentially work their way through the gears on their own. At the dawn of the automobile, if you knew how to drive at all, you knew how to drive manual. Hell, it was called standard for a reason, right? But in the century that followed, the skill eroded for any number of reasons that may or may not be valid. I'm talking stuff like, automatics are easier, they're less expensive, they're easier to maintain, I'm in a clingy relationship and I need my shifting hand free at all times for her to hold, and so on and so forth. And look, whether they're good reasons or not, they're true to enough people that the manual transmission has seen a slow decline that is gradually accelerating as we enter into the age of options like electric cars, which render a manual transmission mechanically unnecessary, and other issues like rising prices and a declining enthusiast base. Okay, maybe the number of enthusiasts isn't actually declining so much as the amount of enthusiasts willing to shell out to buy a manual transmission car new. And on the one hand, it'd be great to keep getting new cars that are equipped with manual transmissions just to prop up the used market for those vehicles 5 to 10 years from now. But also, that's not really feasible, right? Not to the automakers, nor to the dealerships who'd be tasked with moving that product. And trust me, a lot of those places are going to mark it up to make it worth their while. Ugh. So let's talk about it. Why are manual transmissions going away? Are they going away, or has this all been blown out of proportion? Let's investigate.
Roman report at the end of the month, and I make what I want when I feel like discussing cars.
So it was recently announced that the arrival of the 2025 Volkswagen Golf R later this year will mark another loss in the column of manual transmissions, as a 7-speed DSG automatic will be the only available option. And in fact, manuals will be disappearing from all GTIs and Golf Rs after 2024. Volkswagen literally just did that Thanos snap and now they're vanishing, they're crumbling to dust. And just like all the people Thanos snapped away, maybe you'll see them again in 5 years. But I guarantee you they are not going to come back looking the same because they're going to be found in dealer lots after being used like a box of tissues and a pile of socks after a bad breakup. So yeah, I mean, that kind of sucks, but look at it this way. They aren't the only brand who's ditching manuals. Why did I write that like it was going to lead into a positive statement? Yeah, it looks like Volkswagen is not the only brand that is trading in manual transmissions in favor of power increases. As it turns out, the 2025 Honda Civic Sport, the Civic Sedan, and the Sport Touring hatchbacks will be ditching the stick shift also. The only manual you're going to be able to get is whatever booklet comes in the glove box. Not surprisingly, this decline has been a long time coming. In fact, it's kind of surprising that this didn't happen sooner. Let me explain. Despite manual transmissions essentially being the basis around which the automobile came to prominence, the overwhelming rise of the automatic transmission from 1938 to around the mid-1950s was hard to deny, with options like GM's Hydra-matic, Buick's Dynaflow, and the Ford-O-matic, Cruise-O-matic, Merc-O-matic, whatever name you wanted to give that 3-speed Borg-Warner. It all played a part. In much the same way that electric cars render manual transmissions a mechanical redundancy, the arrival of the automatic begged the question of why manuals even still existed if a more convenient option was around. I mean, why still use an icebox when refrigerators were around? But like the icebox, manual transmissions still persisted, and the answer why is twofold. For one, just as today, there were people who simply enjoyed driving manual transmissions more. That's what they knew. That's what they preferred. That's what they enjoyed. But second, and more importantly, manual transmission cars were still selling. Now, as for why they were still selling, you could argue for any number of contributing factors like the volume of muscle and performance cars that featured manuals that were still considered cool and desirable, and more importantly, affordable. From Mustangs and Camaros to Corvettes and Firebirds to Porsches, BMWs, Nissans, and Toyotas. But another factor that could possibly be overlooked in this time period is something that we bring up a lot on RCR because it really is a pivotal moment in automotive history, and that is the 70s oil crisis. It punctured the auto industry in the 1970s, leading consumers to actively seek out more fuel-efficient options. Manual-equipped cars were more fuel-efficient at a time where there was a premium on fuel and you had people carpooling to save money, if they even bothered having a car at all for those years. If the thrill of connection to the car and the road couldn't get the job done for manual transmissions, the possibility of keeping a little weight to your wallet definitely would. Put simply, manual transmissions just made sense for a lot of Americans. And this was still the case in the following decade. According to findings by the San Diego Union Tribune, manual transmissions still accounted for roughly 35% of the market in 1980, and declines in the number of manual transmissions produced and sold were still minimal in comparison to today's sudden, steep year-over-year drop. It isn't until the 90s that we really start to see the numbers begin to take a nosedive. A 2020 report by CarMax showed that in 1995, 26.8% of all vehicles sold in the United States were manual transmission. Not so bad, right? I mean, I kind of expected worse. It's only a drop of 3.2% from 1980. But then the numbers sort of just kept falling. Between 1995 and 2020, sales declined roughly 89.5%. With J.D. Power reporting that just 1.7% of cars sold in the United States were equipped with a manual transmission as of September 2023. And believe it or not, this is actually an improvement over 2022, where the number was just 1.2%, which itself is an improvement over 2021, where it was just 0.9%. Right now, the number of new manual transmission vehicles in the United States continues to shrink each year. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of between 30 and 35 production cars in the United States that are available with manual transmissions that we can just get without importing. And those cars include options like the Dodge Challenger, which is being discontinued, the Chevy Camaro, which is being discontinued, the Hyundai Elantra N, which is being discontinued, the Cadillac Blackwing, which is being discontinued, the Volkswagen GTI Golf and Golf R, whose manual transmission versions are being discontinued. And yeah, you see where I'm going with this, right? Like, sure, you still have options like the BMW M Series, the Integra Type S, the Nissan Z, the Supra, even stuff like the Bronco and the Tacoma. But how affordable is it to drive a manual transmission car when you want to exercise that option? In the past, it was generally true that manual transmission-equipped cars cost less than automatics. But in recent years, manual transmissions are treated as a value add, often being made available only on higher trim levels, or with specific engine combinations like the most recent Mustang, where you could really only get the manual transmission with the V8, or the aforementioned Elantra N, or the Kia Forte GT, where the manual's really only available on the highest trim levels. Of course, some automakers make manuals more accessible for their cars, like with the Nissan Versa of all things, which offers a manual on its cheapest trim level, and Subaru with the WRX, which ironically offers a 6-speed manual on all trims but their highest GT trim. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Porsche's continuing efforts to keep manual transmissions on the road, or BMW doing more or less the same. But in the grand scheme of things, the past decade has been a time of decline for new car sales in general, never mind for manual transmissions, and it all correlates with a dramatic increase in prices due to scarcity related to the global chip shortage, and extortionate pricing from dealerships whose markup schemes I discussed at length in last month's report, link in the description. Automakers are looking for the instant sales gratification rather than hoping to make it up on the back end when prices go down once the sheen wears off. When you invest all that time and money, you can't just wish that a slow start will indicate a long tail. All of this is a shocking decline for what was once the de facto way to drive. The manual transmission was born in 1894, brought screeching into the world by two men, Émile Levasseur and Louis-René Penhard. I probably butchered that. My apologies. But they were essentially the fathers of the manual transmission. At least until Louis Renault improved upon their design by switching the chain drive for a drive shaft and differential rear axle. 30 years later, Cadillac released their synchronized manual transmission, and it seemed like smooth shifting manuals were here to stay. That is, until GM stormed onto the scene with their first automatic transmission. Well, semi-automatic, as 1937 saw the release of the automatic safety transmission, refined a year later with the unveiling of the aforementioned 5-speed hydromatic transmission. By the end of the decade, Chevrolet, Ford, and Plymouth joined in on the carousel, and by 1948, Buick released the Dynaflow to add to the historical transition towards automatic transmissions as the standard, no pun intended, okay, kind of intended, standard of the automotive industry. A 2021 report by Statista Research Department found that by 1957, more than 80% of the market in the United States consisted of automatic transmission-equipped vehicles. And while, as reported by earlier studies, the manual transmission was able to win back some of its territory in the 70s and 80s, its time at the forefront of the auto industry was essentially over. Well, except in Europe and other parts of the world, naturally, where manual transmission cars remained dominant even as they, too, witnessed declines. For example, in 2000, manual transmissions accounted for 89% of all new cars registered in Europe, with numbers climbing as high as 95% in countries like Italy, Spain, France, Ireland, Portugal, Hungary, and Greece. By 2023, they were still hovering around 32% global sales for manual transmission cars, which is roughly 26.6 times the number of sales from the same period in the United States. So then it begs the question, why is the manual transmission in decline here in the United States? And yes, in some areas of the world globally. So I guess the past couple of minutes kind of answers that in the sense that people simply weren't buying them. And in a way, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People don't buy manual transmissions, so companies make fewer cars with manual transmissions, and yeah, there are plenty of anecdotal stories of how difficult it is to find a certain car in manual at any of your local dealerships because they all sold out. But how many were even available to that dealer to sell in the first place? Another reason is tied to the first. So people aren't buying manuals, and maybe it's because they're expensive to buy. Well, they're expensive to buy because they're expensive to make. An article from March 1st by Motor One's Chris Perkins featured an interview with Porsche 911 product developer Michael Rossler, who notes that manual-equipped cars are expensive for them too. As Perkins writes, quote, "Drive-by noise regulations affect gear ratio selection, for example. As a hypothetical, if a car has to be below a certain noise threshold at 35 miles per hour, you can simply program the car to use a higher gear. In a manual car, you obviously can't." End quote. This is a point that ties into a broader thesis of the types of regulations and manufacturing requirements that some automakers have to hit in order for their cars to be able to reach the public in the first place. Whether it's noise or particles, emissions can be a tough nut for manual engineers to crack without passing the expenses along to the consumer. And, as Perkins' article goes on to note, quote, a lot of modern manual cars have rev hang when the engine maintains speed even after the driver pushes in the clutch pedal. Normally, this unburned fuel would enter the combustion chamber, enriching the air-fuel mixture and increasing emissions. Holding the throttle open combusts the fuel, reducing emissions. To make a modern manual car that doesn't do this while also meeting emissions requirements is hard. Rossler says it requires a lot of developmental work on calibration to achieve this. End quote. Alright, so that's 2 reasons down. So what's the third reason? Alright, third reason, it's a skill issue. Yeah, we generally have fewer manual drivers in the United States. People simply don't know how to do it. That thing about a manual transmission being the millennial anti-theft device, yeah, that's a nice joke, but as we all know, the best jokes are rooted in truth. And that's more or less the case here, as US News and World Reports found that only 18% of American drivers know their way around a manual transmission, which flies in the face of a survey from Cadillac ahead of the release of the Blackwing CT4 and CT5. That survey found that it's actually 66% of Americans who know how to drive manual. Now, I've never been great at math, but I'm pretty sure that's more than half. And look, I'm not sure I believe it's as low as 18%, but I don't know that I buy it being in the high 60s either. If for no other reason than the massive decline in manual transmission sales. But aside from issues like cost and skill, why else might new manual transmission-equipped cars have trouble selling? Well, my theory is that the answer rests somewhere within the premise of the question, because I think the operative word there is new. This is an area where Cadillac's survey comes in handy. You see, their respondents reflected 2 data points. The first is that roughly 62% of respondents between the ages of 18 and 34 showed interest in learning how to drive a manual transmission-equipped car, which correlates with their finding that the older you are, the likelier it is you already know how to drive stick, with the highest number of manual driving respondents being age 55 or older. And so it is that the elder is responsible for teaching the younger. If you know how to drive stick, you are going to be what keeps it alive for future generations. Now hang with me here, as this dovetails into another finding from the report that states, quote, interest in learning to drive a stick was higher among those with household income over $75,000 than those with lower incomes. End quote. From this, we can infer that one of the reasons new manual transmission cars don't sell as well is because the people who want them aren't in a position to afford them, but also they don't know how to drive them even if they could. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics cites that an American's peak earning years tend to be between the ages of 45 and 55. Sure, you could lease or finance a new car long before that point, and probably will, or at least new-ish, but how many people are going to make it a priority to get the nicest possible car they can finance or lease, rather than just getting, something that's a few model years old that's a bit more affordable? And look, let's say you had the option. There might still be extenuating circumstances, like it's a car shared between you and a spouse or partner, and you know how to drive stick, but they don't. So you're in a position where you can get a new car, but you're also in a position where it kinda has to be an automatic. Basically, the landscape of the automotive marketplace is such that in some cases, the people who want manual transmission-equipped cars are locked out of buying them by any combination of factors from cost, necessity, or lack of knowledge, since one would think that unless you attend a driving school of some sort, you'd need to know someone who already knows how to drive stick to then teach you, because I can't imagine too many people are doing like our buddy Tony Airlines and buying a manual Honda Beat and figuring it out on the drive home. You need to rely on somebody who already knows, someone from that 55 and over crowd, or, obviously someone younger, because 90% of the people I know who drive stick are well under the age of 55. So again, I'm not sure I entirely buy everything in that Cadillac survey, but generally knowledge about something, a skill set, it just doesn't materialize out of thin air. You have to learn it from somebody. You need the tactile experience for it to be able to sink in and become a foundation of your knowledge. Maybe you do pull a Tony Airlines. Maybe you do go and buy something manual and then you figure it out on the drive home. But even if you were to do that, is that the kind of risk you're taking on a new model year car? A current model year car, Or are you going to buy something used, something junky, something eminently disposable upon which to learn? Which brings me to my next theory of why manual transmission sales are in the garbage. Enthusiasts don't buy new. Okay, some of them do. This is not meant to be a blanket statement applying to all or even most car enthusiasts, alright? But I mean, come on, really? Why do you think sites like Bring a Trailer, Hemmings, Cars and Bids, and one other interesting site that, I'll get to a little later, why do they even exist? And it's for one reason. It's because enthusiasts love old shit. America doesn't run on Duncan. America runs on nostalgia and a recursive ideology that keeps us looking to the past for all the answers because we think going back to some mythical golden age that is different for every American is going to somehow fix all of the problems that we have today. For boomers, it's going back to the 1950s. For Gen X, it's going back to like the 80s and 90s. For millennials, I'm the 90s too. Even as we had access to less information, although the quality of information was probably better. I don't even think probably, I think it is. Because one of your outlets for information right now, it's fucking me. And look, yeah, I got my master's. I did all my work. I was a good boy, but I'm not exactly Walter Cronkite here. I'm not even John Oliver. I'm doing my research. I'm citing my sources. But again, a lot of the places that are issuing information today are only as good as the sources from which they get their information. But that information is not always firsthand. And there are plenty out there that don't disclose that it isn't firsthand. So, where was I? Oh, okay, so I'm getting off my old man soapbox. Why did I say salt box? Is there such a thing as a salt box? Hey, Tommy, if I was going to break your balls, I'd tell you to go home and get your salt box. See what I mean? Going back to the 90s. So yes, car culture is propped up by the only constant that exists in this world. That it was always better in my day. Because just like the nickels in your pocket, change is hard. And just like the pennies in your pocket, change is disappointing and sometimes useless too. A lot of enthusiasts don't like the direction the auto industry is taking with all these tech-heavy cabins and these giant iPad touchscreen infotainment systems and driver assistance tech, the electric vehicles, the SUVification of automotive design. And hey, some automakers may still make manual transmissions, but not all manual transmissions are created equal, not even within the same automaker. I mean, even the Mark IV Supra had a 5-speed W58 manual transmission and a 6-speed V16X, which is different from the modern ZF S653 transmission in the GR Supra. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse, maybe it's a lateral move, I don't know. But ultimately, differences are bound to abound. What did I do with my thesaurus? Now, what I've learned in my experience with automotive auction listings is that a manual transmission is always a significant value add. because for a lot of enthusiasts, it's their chance to experience something they may have heard of their entire lives but never got to experience. And I'm not talking about manual transmissions in general, but specific cars with specific manual transmissions that you need to drive an MR2, that you need to drive an S2000, that you need to drive a Z car, that you need to experience these things before they're gone, and you're lucky enough to live in a time where that's possible, and within the means to make that possible in some cases. There are so many things I would have liked to experience if time travel were possible. The 1893 World's Fair, the Golden Age of Hollywood, New York City in the 1920s, drive-ins and car shows in the 1960s, malls in the 1980s. I mean, yeah, I was alive in the 80s, but I barely had any sentience, but I can't go back. However, if my dream is to hop behind the wheel of an R32, and I'm in the position to make that dream a reality, you bet your sweet bipper I'm going to try. Even if that means passing up a modern car that's technically better but lacks the same soul. And what happens as a result? That Supra that was engineered for a guy like me gets passed up by a guy like me and isn't sold. Toyota takes a loss and a lesson. Let's not make any more cars for that asshole. They cost companies money and then don't bring that money back. And again, it's something of a miracle that it's taken this long for manual transmission numbers to crater the way they have. Of course, while the situation is grim, let's not end this on a downer note because there is hope. So let's talk about some of the positive stories in the world of the manual transmission and the outlook for its future. As with all instances of hope, the destiny of the manual transmission appears to rest squarely in the hands of our youth. No, not in the memory of our own youth in a time where we could still get out of bed in the morning with a different part of our body being stiff than our back, neck, and knees. Hey, if you're still young, just disregard. Lord knows if you're from Europe, you could probably have just discarded this entire video. No, the hope of the manual transmission's future rests with the young drivers in America. EIN Newswire documented the recent upward trend in manual transmissions, citing the same Kelly Blue Book study I cited earlier in the video, except whereas I cited the number of manual transmission car sales in the past year as a negative, they utilized it as a sign for hope, as well they should have, because while it may seem unimpressive for manuals to jump from 0.9% to 1.7% in sales, that is an increase of nearly double in just a single year. And the reality is that there's something of a renewed interest among young drivers for manual transmission cars because it's something of a status symbol, to say nothing of the appeal for parents interested in buying new cars for their kids. Victor Figlin, the general manager for famed Indiana car dealership Indy Automan, states, quote, "If earlier Americans selected a manual transmission for reasons of economy and cited lower fuel consumption and cheaper repairs as arguments, now stick shifters have turned into an image tool. Many sports cars, like the Dodge Challenger Scat Pack, offer manual transmission for better controllability. Moreover, parents often opt for 3-pedal models for their children, so they are less distracted by their smartphones behind the wheel." End quote. The article goes on to state, quote, "In addition, with the supply of electric vehicles on the market growing, U.S. buyers are driven by nostalgia and the desire to get the old driving experience." What did I say? What did I say? What did I say? What did I say? Most car dealerships tend to provide customers with manual options, but they are selling out very fast. The best seller on the US market is the manual Honda Civic. The top popular models include Ford Mustang, Subaru WRX, Volkswagen Golf, and Jeep Wrangler. End quote. Now, another reason to maybe not write off the manual transmission just yet is that other auction site I alluded to earlier. Launched in December 2023, Row Your Own is an auction website dealing exclusively in manual transmission cars. And you get a good variety. And it's interesting how each online automotive auction site seems to have a unique market that they service. The older classics and high-end offerings tend to be on Hemmings and Bring a Trailer, stuff like a Jaguar XKQ 140 or a 65 Shelby Daytona to go along with the higher-priced modern offerings like a $300,000 Lambo. Meanwhile, Cars and Bids will get you all the good stuff made after 1980. Along with some high-end offerings of their own, with McLarens, Ferraris, and Countachs in excess of $500,000. And that's without even getting into the Cybertrucks, which, while not selling for $500,000, still go for a lot of money. Basically, while the used car market still sucks, we're arguably in a golden age of what you can actually find on auction sites, as people are out here selling cars left and right, and oftentimes in actually good condition, better than good condition in some cases too, and affordable at least relative to what you'd get at a dealership, and you own it outright without predatory financing. I totally get why people would go to online marketplaces, and this is without even talking about stuff like Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, which are more unregulated but still provide an outlet for potentially finding good deals. Ultimately, no matter what weird anti-manual CNN articles might say, the benefits of a manual transmission are still as apparent today as they were decades ago. In most cases, they still cost less than their automatic counterparts. They still get great fuel economy, even if CVTs post better numbers sometimes. And they're generally just more engaging and fun to drive for a lot of people. It may not be a universal opinion, but again, it's true for enough people that manual transmissions still warrant inclusion on the road. And not just on the road, but among new cars on the road. Even as the numbers dwindle and the death of the manual transmission seems closer than it's ever been, there is still that glimmer of hope, if not to turn fortunes around, then to keep them from plummeting further, so that further generations might still enjoy the experience when they come of age. That is, if internal combustion isn't dead by then. Alright, so what do you think? Is the manual transmission truly at its end, or is there going to be a resurgence? Or will things just sort of trickle along as they have been, where the manual transmission continues to exist, but only for a niche market? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read all of them. Good, bad, indifferent, whatever the comments. I feel like I gotta read them. But thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider sharing, leaving a like, subscribing, or if you feel RCR brings any sort of value to your week whatsoever, consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description. I would like to thank you again for watching, and safe driving, everyone.